In this video, I want to go over a few items with regard to the problem list slash chronic conditions list and provide a little more emphasis on how if you build your chronic conditions out a little more appropriately up front, it can actually start saving you a lot of time, but also help with your charting accuracy, particularly with respect to reflecting the complexity of your patients. So when it comes to the histories section, there's two places you can get to it. Number one, and this is just a good time to remind you of this, the little house icon that sits over here all by itself is actually a wealth of information. This is sort of the one-stop shop for almost everything in their chart. So for example, if you want to see every history of present illness the person's had, you can find that all in one place. And this is a good patient to check this out on because there's a lot of different providers and a lot of different visits. So if you wanted to sort it by just the ones that I have done, then boom, very quickly I can see just my visits, date, and what I saw them for. Now, since this is a test patient, it doesn't really have a proper HPI put in, but you can see how it would have been started. And in this one, for example, you can see some text that goes along with it. As you can see running down the list here, you can look at all sorts of things on these patients. Again, all one-stop shop. It's the history of their chart all in one place. So the problem list is what I'm really wanting to address. So this is the first place that you can find it, and for what it's worth, I'll keep giving you a little, if you keep going down, check this little house icon out. There's a wealth of knowledge here. But anyway, problem list can be found here. The other place that the problem list can be found is over here under the history section. Same identical thing. So this whole section down here is actually new. So one of the unfortunate things that NextGen does that's confused many a physician over time is that they have chosen to use two different forms of nomenclature. They used the ICD codes that we're used to, and then they also use another group called SNOMED codes. SNOMED codes were basically a way of making ICD-9 codes even more specific back in the day. We moved to ICD-10, which is more specific, but unfortunately SNOMED hasn't gone away. So unfortunately, you will probably notice that there are both SNOMED and ICD-10 codes. SNOMED is purely just for more record keeping than anything else, whereas the ICD-10 is what we need. One of the problems we had before with this was that there wasn't always a one-to-one match between a SNOMED and an ICD-10 code. This often drove people like Dr. Barkley crazy because it would often give you a pick list. So you try to save your chronic conditions, but it wouldn't save it by ICD-10. Finally, now you have the ability to assign SNOMEDs to a specific ICD-10 for a particular patient, so it sticks once and for all. The other thing that this new edition allows you to do is you can actually start charting your chronic problems directly from the problem list, which is pretty nice. This is particularly good for the patients that have multiple chronic problems and you don't want to forget to mention them from one visit to the next, which sometimes can be a challenge if you're going by the billing diagnosis list in the assessments template. Where this also becomes an issue is the confusing part about coding to highest level of complexity for the patient. The best way that I've figured out to make sense of this is that, particularly in primary care, we are not only responsible for the visit that day and then the appropriate CPT code that goes with it, but we're also responsible for reflecting how sick the person is. So even though you may be seeing them just for their bronchitis today, if they are an uncontrolled type 2 diabetic, you want to put that in the code as well, even if you're not managing the diabetes, because this reflects to the insurance company that this is a more sickly individual than somebody who doesn't have that. So keep in mind, all of this is pretty much running in the background of our brains, that we know how sick the person is in front of us. The insurance companies, however, are trying to find better ways to also reflect that. The other area where that's important is the sicker the patient, the more money that gets allocated to them, and also then the more money that gets allocated to us. So this is one of the things that particularly the Medicare Advantage groups have been trying to hit home with us, is that we really want to be reflecting how sick the person is, because at the end of the day, CMS then provides more funds to take care of that person. So think of it that you are the one that is responsible for generating the revenue for the patient's care for the entire year. And so if you reflect that they look much healthier than they are, then actually the bucket of money they get for their care is much lower. So anyway, back a little bit to the problem list. Sorry for the side, but I think that continues to need some reinforcement. So in this patient, I have built out the problem list. Now the problem list is also a reflection of what you see up here, all together there. And the way that the problem list is generally made, you can do it one-off by adding items. So for example, through this problem list, when it finally opens, in a painfully slow fashion, it'll be better when we get into development. You can actually go to add problem here, and you could add a problem this way. Now part of the problem here is that it's going in under a SNOMED, so that may create an issue down the road. But now it's added into the problem list. You can see that went to 13. The other place that problems can and probably should be more easily added is when you're in the assessment section right here. You have assessments, which is what you're seeing them today for, problems, which is that chronic problem list, or if you're seeing them for something that is both today and going to be a new problem not already in the list on the side, you can click on both. Again, SNOMED codes over here, which does create some of the issue. So back to our problem list here. My guess is Lyme disease is probably now hidden in here somewhere. Probably I'd have to refresh it. Sorry, let me see if I can. Well, I'll find it's in there, just have to find it again. So if you're going to address their renal disorder, as you can see now, we've got renal disorder. It was a SNOMED code, but it's actually now been matched to this particular ICD-10 code. A couple of important things. One is, if it is going, this is a little bit of another nuance of NextGen that's a bit on the challenging side, but problem list and chronic problems are not always the same. You want to make sure that anything that is a problem list that you're going to be following, mark it as chronic. It helps for sorting purposes later, and where it really helps is that soon you will be able to carry forward plans from one visit to a next if it's considered a chronic problem. So, and clinical status, so let's say they're stable today, and then you can add it to today's assessment if you'd like, and actually it's probably better off to be, for today's note, to be using the stable down here. Also, if you want to add a little bit of a note on this, you could say, sees renal next week. And that'll stay in there, plus you'll be able to look at all previous notes. So I've added that to today's assessment. Add an update. Oops, sorry on this one. Let's say degenerative disc disease. Also, we're going to add that to today's assessment. They are worse. Add an update. There's Lyme disease. And this is a good example. So which Lyme disease do you want? Strangely enough, there are 2 codes that go along with it. It came in as a SNOMED code, so you really need to pick which one you want. We'll go Lyme unspecified, select, and so now it has tied in A69.20 to this particular patient's Lyme disease. So I'm also going to add this to today's, and we'll put improved. You get the gist. Add an update. So for example, now when I go over to their SOAP note and I go down to their assessment and plan, you can start to see already that it started building out those, reflects their stability. And so where these can really be useful is in the situation where, again, you're just trying to comment on a chronic disease state. Maybe you're not necessarily managing it that day. Also, if you did a hemoglobin A1C with that, it also nicely associated that. I'll dovetail a little bit. I'm going to do a new video on this, new edition also, but showing chronic here. So you can see it's pulled in this comment already, which I can then add over here, and then as I build this out, and again I'll do a new video on this in a minute, you can almost do your whole note on chronic conditions out of this chronic conditions template. It's pretty cool, pretty impressive and robust as well. So anyway, that's the long and short of the problem list. Like I said, strongly encourage people to start trying to build out that problem list, identify their chronic conditions. It really reflects the complexity of the patient much better. It's much easier when another provider is seeing them to quickly look up at what their chronic problems are, not just what their long list of diagnoses are. And as you make them into chronic problems,